Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, and share buttons. Well, this is going to be our last video for 2022. And rather than look back at what's happened over the year past, I want to try to look ahead and try to figure out, well, what is going to happen in 2023? So I have my thoughts on what I think is most likely to happen in the year ahead and what the prophetic implications are for that. But first, I want to make it very clear, these aren't prophecies I'm making. These are just observations. Based on my observations, what I think are the most high probability events to take place in 2023. So I think they're going to happen, but I don't have any sort of divine revelation. I'm not claiming that by any means. But I'm just looking around at the world around me and I think, well, is this likely to happen? I think it is. And so we're going to talk about 5 specific things, and really in the order, I think, of importance or likelihood that they will happen. And then we're going to talk about a 6th event that I think has a lower probability of occurring, but still has a very high probability of occurring and would have significant, really catastrophic consequences for the world. And then we're going to tie all of that into Bible prophecy, what it means for the world as we go forward. So, number 1, what do I think is the most likely event we're going to see in 2023? Hands down, I believe that it is a global financial crisis, on par with the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, there are many reasons for this. I'm just going to touch over some of these reasons. In the weeks ahead, we'll give more in-depth videos on each of these topics and how they'll play out. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see a lot of these things play out in the year ahead. Number 1, we've talked all through the year about the European energy crisis. It has not gone away, even though the media isn't talking about it every day, even though lights aren't permanently out all throughout Europe all day long. They are experiencing rolling blackouts, and more importantly, they're experiencing much higher energy prices than they did a year ago, 2 years ago. And the implications of that for household budgets, company budgets, government budgets, has huge financial consequences the longer the duration of this energy crisis, and it cannot be fixed overnight. When Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines were destroyed back in September, something the media just stopped talking about. Wonder why that is, at least in the Western world. That put an end once and for all for any idea that there could be a quick fix to the energy crisis in Europe. So this is leading to the deindustrialization of Europe. We talked earlier this year about, I think it was in September, there were 4 companies in Germany and 4 totally different industries that had all operated. The youngest of those companies was 125 years old. And they all 4 went out of business on the same day. And the reason, energy is the lifeblood of any economy. You cannot operate an economy without energy. And Europe right now cannot compete globally with energy prices that are several times what they are in all the rest of the world. They just cannot. And so we're going to see industries shutting down. And collectively, when you look at all of the nations of Europe, we're talking about the largest economy in the world. No, people point to the United States and China as the largest economies in the world, and they are on a national basis. But if you take collectively the area of Europe that has been impacted by these poor energy policies, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, the dependence on Russia for natural gas, when you look at that area that is impacted, collectively, all those national economies are the largest economy in the world. And to believe that their energy prices can double or triple or quadruple or more on some instances and not have an impact on the world economy is really just burying your head in the sand. It's not reality. We're going to see ripple effects throughout the global supply chain as a result of that. We're going to see mass layoffs. We're going to see government welfare services all throughout Europe strained as governments have to print more currency in order to pay for people who have lost their jobs, who can't afford their energy bills, who can't afford food because of the higher cost of that. And then, of course, people who invest in or buy those government debt instruments for those countries in Europe are going to start to question the reality of whether they could ever hope to be paid back or not. And so we're going to see sovereign debt crises all throughout the world. And we'll touch more on that here soon, because I think that's going to be a big theme in this financial crisis, this global financial crisis that we see. What else are we going to see? Well, we've seen the Federal Reserve all throughout 2022 raising interest rates in the United States. So why is that important? Well, when you look at the rate at which they have raised rates, and we're going to look at that in a future video and go more in depth, but it's the most in a single year, that percentage change by far in all of history. And to believe that that won't break something, that won't have catastrophic consequences, that it won't lead to another Lehman Brothers type collapse that causes a credit crisis throughout global markets is, again, I believe, being very naive. But this time, maybe the Lehman Brothers is the United States itself, because by raising those rates, what has to happen is the national debt of the United States has to be refinanced over time as those different debt securities come due and are rolled over into new ones at higher rates. And that means we're going to see the interest on the national debt as an expense in the annual budget for the United States climbing and climbing in the months ahead. It's already started, but we're also going to see, as the economy slows from those higher interest rates, less taxes being collected by the United States government. And so you're going to see the budget deficit expand exponentially to, I believe, trillions of dollars. And by the end of the year, I believe we'll see over $1 trillion a year in interest expense on the national debt. And people are going to start to question whether the debt load of the United States is sustainable or not. And that means that they're going to start to sell off U.S. government debt. And what does that do to the interest rate on that debt? What does that do on the ability of the United States to continue to live beyond its means and pay for all these social programs, all this military spending with debt? The Federal Reserve will have to go out and buy that debt, monetize that debt, or they will have to make a dramatic pivot and lower interest rates down again in a high inflationary environment, which is going to put strain on the US dollar. And people are going to realize, well, the purchasing power of the US dollar is dramatically going down. So I don't want to hold that either. But that also means I don't want to hold those US debt instruments. So in the past, in a low inflationary environment, the United States was able to get away with this. I think we've come to a point in time where no matter what road they take, high interest rates, low interest rates, it doesn't matter. We're heading toward a major inflationary event in the United States with the US dollar. And as we see countries start to drop their holdings of US treasuries and debt instruments, and that's going to put the United States under a huge strain in the year ahead. What else do we see? Well, we see a major bubbles, unlike we've ever seen before. Stock market bubbles, as big as we've ever seen. Housing bubbles, as big as we've ever seen. We see bond bubbles. All of these bubbles are popping right now. So for instance, I want to take a look at this right here. What we're looking at is called the Buffett indicator. And this particular website, for whatever reason, says that the US stock market is fairly valued. I don't know where they're getting that idea from, because Warren Buffett himself does not indicate that 158% on the Buffett indicator is fairly valued. In fact, he would say that that's significantly overvalued. So what does this mean? Well, this is a ratio that compares the value of the United States stock market to the United States GDP, or gross domestic product, meaning all the goods and services produced by the US economy in a year. What is the value of those? And let's compare it to the stock market. Now, a value over 100% indicates that the stock market is more valuable than all the goods and services produced in a year by the United States, which, when you think about it, is absurd. And that's Warren Buffett's position. I believe he said that fair value is somewhere between 60 and 80%. So you want to invest ideally in that range or lower than that range, because there have been a few times in history where it's gone lower than that range. But let's look at where we are right now and get some perspective historically on what that 158% valuation right now means. So this timeline goes back to 1950. We can't see 1929 on this particular graph, but it's higher. We're higher now than we were then. But we see throughout, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we had this range. We were around 150% in the dot-com bubble, which was one of the biggest bubbles in history that led to an 80% decline in the NASDAQ valuation from peak to trough. Then we see here where we were before the great financial crisis. That was somewhere over 100%. I'm not sure the exact figure, 110, something like that, before plummeting. And I think the market went down about 50% at that time. But as of last year, we're down about 20% on the S&P 500 since the all-time highs a little over a year ago, I believe it was. But even with that decline, we're at 158%. That's higher than the dot-com bubble, even now. So there's still a long ways to go for stocks to fall. If you don't believe that indicator, let's look at this. This is the Case-Shiller PE ratio. So this is developed by experts in this area. Shiller is a professor of economics who's big into this sort of thing. But here we have this data that goes back to the end of the 19th century, and it indicates that the price to earnings ratios, which that's just for every dollar of earnings, how much are you paying? That's an indication of the valuation of the stock market over at a certain point in time and over time. But the lower that ratio is, the more undervalued something is relative to the higher it is. Here we see when the market crashed in 1929, we had a PE ratio of around 30 for the market. That reached up almost to 45, 44 or so during the dot-com bubble. And it was in the mid-30s at the recent market high, but we're still, even with the market, again, going down around 20% from its recent high and its all-time high, we're still at 27.91, which is pretty close to what it was when the market crashed on Black Tuesday in 1929, which was one of the main events at the beginning of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So that gives you an indication of the type of bubble we've been in, stock market-wise, and how much further it has to go down. Along those lines, it's not just the stock market, but it's bonds as well. So we see this tweet. It says 2022 is the worst year ever for stocks and bonds since 1871. So we see this tracks the nominal return of U.S. stocks and bonds for each year since 1871 to 2022. Here's the return for 2022, this outlier out here. Very rarely do you see the stock market declines of 20% and see bonds also declining, or vice versa. They're typically inversely correlated, meaning if stocks go up, bonds go down. If bonds go up, stocks go down. they don't move in tandem. That's why most people's portfolios are constructed to be a balance of the two. Typically, you would have a lot of financial advisors out there push a portfolio of 60% stocks, 40% bonds, or vice versa, depending on what your age is, what's going on in your financial life. But that has not turned out well this year. It's really been an outlier for the last 100+ years of history, 150 years of history, right here. And here we are for 2022. Now, I'm recording this. The market's still open a few more hours, so that could change. But I don't think it's going to change that quickly. I think we're going to see this end up here. And unfortunately, the year ahead, I believe, will not be much better. We may very well see 2023 hanging out around here as well. Housing. What about the housing market and real estate? So this is from Wall Street Silver. It shows a chart of U.S. home prices versus U.S. income. Now, historically, housing prices are a reflection of a person's income. So their ability to pay for the house or their ability to make that house payment is a reflection of their income, their earning power. And so let's make this a little bit bigger so we can get an idea here. But here we see average hourly earnings is this blue line. So this is what people are making. Here's all the stimmy checks following the lockdowns. It's a little bump up. But we see here the actual home price index. And we see this right here. This is the housing bubble that led to the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So I'll give you an idea of what led to that, what that looked like. Here we are now. And we've started to see that bubble burst as the interest rates go up. And interest rates, mortgage rates have doubled in the United States since the beginning of the year, more than doubled. And so what that does, most people are purchasing homes based on their ability to make the monthly mortgage payment, not on what the price of the house is per se. So what that means is as interest rates go up, fewer and fewer people are able to afford a mortgage payment for a home of a certain price, which means that those prices have to come down. And as those prices come down, you end up with certain people who are underwater. And if we're heading into the type of financial environment I believe we're heading into, then you're going to have people losing their jobs and then unable to make any payment. And you're going to have foreclosures, and we're going to see this red line go down just like it did here to more closely match the blue line. And what does that mean? That means another housing bubble and another housing crash, another real estate market crash. We also see, it's not in this chart, but on the commercial side of things, you have commercial property developers, people that own office buildings, who have bought these large office buildings and they're leasing out office space to large corporations. Well, for the past 2.5 years, a lot of the people that fill that office space have started working from home. And working from home, their space at that office isn't needed. So we're seeing as leases come to an end, companies aren't renewing those leases. A lot of these buildings are occupied at very low rates. So what does that mean for the people that own that commercial real estate or the banks that lent against that commercial real estate? Again, we're going to see multiple financial fronts being assaulted all at once, with the prices of bonds going down, the prices of stocks going down, the prices of real estate going down. And what does that mean for a world awash in debt? Well, it means debt defaults. What does that mean? Well, that means really a shrinking of the money supply, the currency supply, which leads to deflation and the type of deflationary spiral we saw during the Great Depression. Now, we could argue whether we would see a protracted depression the way we saw in the 1930s. I don't think that we will, because I think the government response is going to be to print currency and hand it out to everybody they can, because that's what politicians do. They try to buy votes. So we're going to see massive inflation on the other side of all of this. And that, of course, leads to the number two high probability of event I see for 2023, which I believe is a major currency collapse. So let's look at this, and specifically, I believe that it's going to be Japan that we see having that crisis. So this is a list of companies' debt to GDP ratios. So this is your national debt versus your total output of goods and services in a year. And here we see, by that metric, the country that's worst off in the world right now is Japan, with a debt to GDP ratio of 240%. That means that for every dollar of output that they're able to generate in their economy, there's $2.4 of debt that they hold, that they owe. So to put that into perspective, the United States, as you can see here, is at 119% debt to GDP ratio. With all the trillions of dollars in debt the United States has, Japan is twice as bad off as the United States is, and that's saying a lot. And so how will Japan deal with this? Well, one way they have been dealing with this is, we can come over here and see, this is a chart of the US dollar to the Japanese yen. That's the exchange rate here. And we've seen how they've been devaluing their currency. They've been printing yen in order to buy their own debt. So you can see that in my book, that's called a Ponzi scheme. It's called fraud. You're putting this debt out, then you're printing the currency. But essentially what that's doing is flooding the world with their currency. And so we've seen here the value was pretty consistent for several years at 103 to 113 per dollar. And then in 2022, we saw this start to dramatically rise. They came out and had said they were going to buy these bonds, and the 10-year Japanese government bond, they had said, we're going to cap the yield of that at 0.25%, meaning you would lend money, lend that currency to the Japanese government for 10 years, and in exchange for that risk, they'll pay you back what you lent them plus 0.25% for that 10 years. Sounds like a great deal, doesn't it? Well, it's not. Nobody was taking them up on it. And Japan had to buy almost over half of that debt, I believe, in order to achieve that. But they bought the debt, any free market mechanism that tried to trade that debt at a higher rate, they went in and bought it so that it wouldn't come. Well, a couple of weeks ago, they announced, well, we're going to move that from 0.25% to 0.5%, but we're really going to defend that. And I think that is an indication that this isn't going to work. It's going to break. And they know that, because if they continue to do that, what we're going to see is the purchasing power of the Japanese yen go to zero over time, because they're going to have to print more and more and more yen in order to buy more and more of their debt, until the whole scheme, and that's what it is, it's a fraud, collapses. Now, that would be a major event with catastrophic consequences throughout the financial world, global financial community. And we would also see, the Japanese own large amounts of U.S. treasuries, U.S. debt, that they would likely sell in the process in order to prop up this whole game. But before you say, hey, wow, I can't believe Japan's doing that, pretty much every government in the world is, and the United States is doing it. They're just a little bit further behind on the time scale than Japan is, but the same thing is going to happen. That's what we talked about with the raising of interest rates and what it would do to the interest on the national debt for the United States. Ultimately, the US dollar is going to lose large amounts of its purchasing power, and US debt is going to be something governments and people do not want to hold unless the interest rates are much, much higher than they are right now. So, we've got a major financial crisis. That's the number one thing I see for 2023. We've got a major market currency collapse. I believe it'll be the Japanese yen in 2023. What's the third thing that I believe will happen? The third thing I believe will happen is we're going to see famine and food shortages. And of course, rising prices, continuing rising prices of food in the year ahead. We've been over this a number of times in the past videos. I'll probably do an update video here soon. But as energy costs have gone up, so has the cost of producing fertilizer gone up. And fertilizer is one of the top two components in farming, along with diesel. And diesel prices are also significantly higher. So food prices have to go up to compensate for that. But we've also seen droughts, we've seen locusts, we've seen the war in Ukraine, we've seen all sorts of things that have impacted what's going on. And of course, those shortages of fertilizer lead to less fertilizer being applied. The higher prices, especially in poorer countries, leads to less being applied, which means less yield per acre, which means less food available. Now, that food, that's going to cause the prices of the agricultural products to go up. And the wealthier countries are going to bid up anything they can. So like, for instance, in Japan, they import, I think it's 60% of their food, which means as the third largest economy in the world, they're going to be spending whatever they can to get whatever food imports to them are available, which means that the price goes up for the poorer countries in the world. They can't get it, and we have famine, unfortunately. And then no matter where you are in the world, if you are not wealthy, then the rise in food prices is going to have an impact on your ability, your financial ability to pay for that, to receive that food. And on the lower rungs of the economic scale, and even the richest countries, you're going to have people that cannot afford food, and they'll be relying on food banks, pantries, government food stamps, whatever it may be, because the food will not be there. Less food is going to be produced in 2023. And that leads to the number 4 thing that I think is most probably going to happen in 2023, and that is widespread social unrest all over the world for the very reasons we just went over. When people lose their jobs, when they can't afford to buy food, they can't afford to pay their utility bills or their rent, people get upset and they take to the streets. It's their last alternative. We saw this in the Arab Spring a decade ago, where food prices went up so much. People took to the streets. The government in Egypt was overthrown at that time. We've seen that in Sri Lanka in 2022 as food and fuel were no longer available. The country went bankrupt. Imports stopped coming in. People took to the streets and overthrew the government. I believe we're going to see the same thing happen in various other countries all over the globe in 2023. And the worse all of this gets, the more occurrences that we're going to see. So what is the number 5 thing that I think is most likely to see in 2023? Well, that would be the rollout of central bank digital currencies. Because I believe this type of crisis, if this financial crisis is on the scale I believe it's on, they're going to use that as an opportunity to roll out central bank digital currencies as the solution. We saw in the United States following the pandemic when they tried to issue these stimulus checks to people. Well, we could do it much faster, but we have to check all these records. It's going to take weeks for it to get to you. They're going to say, if you have this digital wallet, we can immediately get you the funds you need. Go sign up for it now. There's $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 waiting for you. And for people who have lost their jobs, who can't afford rent, who can't afford utilities, who can't afford food, this is going to be a benefit that is too great for them to give up. People will not be able to resist this, and they will go out and sign up for it. So we're seeing countries all over the world testing this right now. It's in the second phase of testing in India. We had the Federal Reserve Bank of New York announce, and I believe it was mid-November, that they were doing a 12, well, maybe it was mid-December. I can't remember. The days are running together, but they're doing a 12-week test at the bank level, at the major bank level, of these central bank digital currencies. And you can be sure they're going to be rolling that out to more and more people, more and more institutions as the year goes by. The Bank of England also came out and said they're going to put out their own digital currency. So we're seeing this all over the world. The Bank of International Settlements said 9 out of every 10 central banks on the face of the earth is exploring central bank digital currency. So this stuff is coming. What else could we see in 2023? Those are the 5 most probable events that I believe that we're going to see. A global financial crisis on a scale of the Great Depression of the 1930s, although probably shorter in duration. We're going to see a major currency collapse, I believe, in Japan. We're going to see famine and food shortages, food inflation. We're going to see widespread social unrest, and we're going to see the rollout of central bank digital currency. But I believe there's also a lower probability, but still a significant possibility of seeing another event that I believe would have catastrophic consequences. So what is that? Well, that would be nuclear war. So we see here in this article, I'm just going to read the headline. It says, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov fears West will try to assassinate Vladimir Putin and start nuclear war over conflict in Ukraine. We've seen all throughout this year how there's been this back and forth between Russia, the United States, NATO, and their allies over the conflict in Ukraine. And this is a potential flashpoint between major nuclear powers that could erupt into maybe a regional nuclear war. It's not going to be nuclear war that destroys the whole planet, because we know the Bible says that that's not going to happen. But we could still see a major conflict on a smaller scale, on a regional scale. And the consequences of that, not just for the people who are directly impacted, but for the whole world, are really beyond the imagination, because you would have disruption of supply chains, financial markets, you would have food shortages, you would have shortages of just about everything. It would be a very, very bad place to be for the world. But it's not just Russia and Ukraine we're talking about. We also have China and Taiwan. This is just from yesterday, this headline. It says, China sails warships near Guam and warning to the U.S. over Taiwan. So we've seen world leaders meeting at high levels. We had Zelensky come to the United States and address Congress, and Nancy Pelosi compared him to Winston Churchill. And we've seen Dmitry Medvedev go to China and meet with Chairman Xi at the same time. So we're seeing the world break up into these blocks, similar to what we saw in World War I and World War II. Are we seeing the beginnings of and the forming of those alliances for another global war? Could happen. The rumors of war are definitely there. And the Bible tells us in Revelation 6 that there will be a World War III. So we know that it's a not just a possibility, but that it will happen at some point. Will 2023 be the year? I have no idea of knowing that, no way of knowing that, but we're certainly setting ourselves up for that. So how does all this fit into the Bible prophecy picture as we go into 2023? I think it's all summed up by this one verse right here, these verses from Matthew 24, verses 6 through 8. It says, and you will hear, this is Jesus speaking, he says, and you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world, but all this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. So what is this telling us? Well, it's telling us, because I believe we live in the season of the Lord's return. We've been over that a number of times. But I believe it's telling us what we're going to see for sure in 2023 is a continuation of the birth pains. What are birth pains like? Well, birth pains increase in frequency and intensity as you get closer and closer to the main event. In this case, the return of Jesus Christ. So as we get closer to that day, we would expect the types of events we just talked about and the types of events Jesus talks about in this passage to increase with greater intensity. We should expect to see those birth pains on a global scale. Now that may mean, just like a birth pain, in between those birth pains you have moments of calm. We may see a month or 2 months or some period of calm, but be sure that the world is not going back to the way it was a few years back. We've seen since 2020 this constant barrage of major news events with Bible prophecy implications. I believe we're going to continue to see that, and we're going to see it ratchet up more and more and more as the days, months, and years go by. So focus on all this, guys. What's the main takeaway for 2023? The main takeaway is Jesus is coming back. When? I don't know. I don't know if it's tomorrow, next week, next year. Don't know. But I know that we are in the season of the Lord's return. Jesus said, when you see all these things take place, know I'm right at the door. I'm coming back. So don't focus on the terrible events of the world and all the bad that could happen and let it bring you down. Don't let it make you fatigued or tired of spirit. Instead, be filled with hope and joy in knowing Jesus is coming back soon, and use whatever time we have left to spread the gospel to as many people as you can. So that's my take for what I think is going to happen in 2023. What do you think? Leave your comments below. Let me know what you think is likely to happen in 2023. I will be back, I believe, on Tuesday. I'm going to take Monday off for the new year, spend time with family. So God willing, I'll see you on Tuesday. But in the meantime, leave your comments below. Make sure to like and share this. And God willing, I'll see you then. Bye. If you want to learn more about the end times and Bible prophecy, make sure to sign up for my free monthly newsletter and get your copy of my free ebook, 7 Signs of the End Times. Just follow the link in the description to get your free book. Also, make sure to check out all of my books. Just look up Britt on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Apple iBooks, Google Books, Kobo, or anywhere books are sold. Thanks for watching today, and until next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith.